Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing just a bit of overclocking on the Ryzen 7 1700 and, well, I guess seeing how far we can really push it on some, I guess, lower end air cooling. So here you can see I am running the Ryzen 7 1700. I guess there's all that stuff right here. For some reason I can't get the core voltage to read on it. It's something that I always have with these Gigabyte Aorus motherboards, with this one and with the Aorus B450M. They both won't read the core voltage and just always read it at this right here, 1.18, and it for some reason bounces between 1.18 and CPU Z, and then the same thing in Ryzen Master. So I will be able to show the voltage offset, but I guess I can't really show the exact voltage I'm running at. Other than that, this right here is, I guess, the first overclock I'll kind of be showing in this video. That's what I actually daily run the CPU at. It's just 3.7 gigahertz at the stock voltage. There's, I guess, more stuff about the CPU, and for my motherboard I am running the Gigabyte Aorus X370 Gaming K5 on the latest F50D BIOS from August 2 of 2020. For RAM, I am running 16 gigabytes of G-Skill Ripjaws 5, rated for 2400, overclock to that 2933 megahertz, and then it is in dual channel like you should have on Ryzen CPUs. It is pretty rare to be able to hit above 3000 on first gen Ryzen, especially when you have it paired with a X370 motherboard, so you probably wouldn't be able to take advantage of really much higher RAM speeds even if you had higher end RAM. Here you can see the rest of the specs right there for this RAM, and then for graphics this will really only matter for the gaming benchmarks. I am running a GeForce 760 because that's the best thing I have access to it. Now I will do some more tests on the CPU once my GTX 1650 Super comes in, but that won't be here for probably another month. For all the gaming tests, we will be running at like 800 by 600 low, so we still will have the load on the CPU, so the graphics card won't be holding us back in any of the gaming benchmarks. And then, yeah, I guess that's really it. So you can see here right now at the stock voltage with that 3.7 gigahertz overclock running a stress test, we hit that max of 68 degrees Celsius, and it's going up to CPU fan. The CPU fan is actually right there. I've running off the fan 4 header. You can see that had a maximum RPM of 3497, and the Wraith Prism cooler should be able to go up to about 4,000. So we aren't quite maxed out on cooling, and we also are running pretty low temperatures, so we definitely do have some overclocking headroom to push this CPU a bit. With that, let's run the benchmarks at stock and then jump into the BIOS. And then just for the rest of my components for the case, I do have the Salmon Tank RGB. This does have pretty great airflow through the front with 3 120mm intake fans. They do push a decent amount of air, but I don't know the exact RPM for them, as these fans are just low and high. And then I do have the Wraith Prism cooler, so this is a bit bigger than the Wraith Spire, but even when I was running the Wraith Spire on the CPU with the 3.7 gigahertz overclocks, my temps were still like 75, 76 degrees, so you should still be able to get a pretty decent overclock with the stock cooler, although I would recommend just buying a cheap, kind of like just like a cheap budget air cooler, because that will give you a good amount more performance along with some better temperatures. Although on the CPU you can't really push it above 3.9 gigahertz, you won't have a huge performance increase. It'll just make your PC a lot more quiet and, well, run cooler, which I guess is good for your CPU. I do also just here in like whatever the top two fan slots, I do have dual 140 mil fans with the front one as intake and the back as exhaust. Alright, starting off with just a baseline Cinebench R23 test at the stock 3 GHz, we got 8040 multi-core and 889 single-core. This was with stock RAM speeds of 2400 MHz and just stock every setting for the CPU. Jumping into the BIOS for some overclocking, first I'm just going to use 2666 CL15 for the RAM and then overclock the CPU to 3.5 GHz as that is a frequency that every Ryzen 1700 should be able to do at stock voltages. And then just rebooting into Windows, it all boots up fine. And then running Cinebench R23, we can see that we do get a decent uplift in multi-core performance to 8,813, so that's like what, 500 points? Rebooting back into the BIOS, going up to 3.7 gigahertz. I like to do about 200 megahertz increments until you start getting system crashes. Again, booting up, we can run Cinebench again, and it all runs fine, again giving us a pretty major score increase to 9,298 points. And then just having hardware monitor in the background to monitor our temperatures. Our CPU did peak at 67 degrees after running this for 10 minutes, with our fan RPM hitting a max of 3150. This fan on the AMD Ryzen Prism cooler can go up to about 3500. So here we do have plenty of temp and like cooler fan speed headroom. And now going up to 3.9 gigahertz, this will probably crash, but just to make sure, running Cinebench again, we get a just black screen almost instantly. For kind of how much voltage you have to add, a black screen is kind of the worst, and then a blue screen of death you have to add less, with then just kind of like an application error message. Then you usually only have to add like a few points of a volt. So going up to plus 0.54 for the dynamic V core. Gigabyte does like to do this voltage offset thing, which I guess I don't really love on their boards, but for overclocking and everything, it does seem to work pretty decent, and I haven't had like any issues related to it. And then when you crash, you have to go through this disk checking thing, which is kind of a pain, and then the whole recovery stuff. And then running Cinebench again with that plus 0.5 volts. That right there is just an application crash, which means you do have to give it a bit more voltage. So here we're going to go up to plus set 0.7, like plus 0.078. And then that is, this is stable. This is about where I'd leave off, especially on the stock cooler. This would be about the max you could hit, and usually you can only get another maybe 100 megahertz from here. We got 9,822 points. Alright, here are the 3 overclocks I decided to test along with their scores. So stock is 3 GHz base, 3.2 GHz all core, along with 2400 megahertz RAM. That did give us 8040 single with 889 overclock, the best overclock I could get with stock voltages was 3.7 gigahertz and 2666 megahertz RAM, giving us an all-core score of 9301, which is a 16% increase above stock, and a single-core score of 955, which is a 7% increase over stock. The maximum overclock I was able to get with my, with my AMD Wraith Prism, which kinda is a pretty budget air cooler. It's still better than the stock, but you would be able to get a similar cooler for under $20. So with that, I did plus 0.144 volts for the V-core, and I took the RAM from 1.2 to 1.35, which allowed us to hit 3.925 gigahertz on all cores, along with 2933 megahertz RAM, which gave us a all-core score of 9887, a 23% increase over stock, and a single core score of 1007, a 13% increase over stock. Alright, starting off with our two synthetic gaming benchmarks. First off with Engine Heaven, using the 360p low preset just to make sure all the strain was on the CPU. At the stock speeds, we got 237 FPS. At 3.7 gigahertz, we got 269.8 FPS, a 32.8% increase, and at 3.925 gigahertz, we got 290.1 FPS, a 53.1% increase. That's actually a pretty big difference, especially in there are a few games now where this CPU is struggling to hit 60 FPS. So in those titles, going from stock to say 3.8, 3.9 gigahertz will give you a pretty big performance increase. Next up, running the GTA 5 built-in benchmark at 800 by 600 using the low settings. Stock gives a minimum FPS of 5, a max of 223.2, and an average of 146.2. At 3.7 gigahertz, we got a minimum FPS of 5.7, a 14% increase, a max of 226.9, a 1.7% increase, and an average of 151.9, a 3.9% increase. Then at 3.925 gigahertz, we got a minimum of 4 FPS, which is 20% lower than we got at stock. A maximum of 252.2, a 13% increase over stock, and an average of 165.0, a 12.9% increase over stock. It is pretty common with overclocks to get a slight drop in the minimum frame rate because you do sometimes lose a bit of that stability, which can give you a few more micro stutters, although that usually can be solved with adding a bit more voltage. Next up at Valorant, for the last two games I did only test at 3 GHz and at 3.925 GHz because I was kind of running out of time working on this. But at 3 GHz we got an average frame rate of 176 with a 1% low of a 101, and at 3.925 GHz we got an average of 214 with a 1% low of 137. This was tested just at 1080p using low settings, and the bottleneck was again on the CPU here because that's what we are testing. Valorant, the frame rate does seem to scale even more than what you're overclocking, so your frame rate does really benefit from overclocking. And if you're into Valorant, I definitely would recommend, especially on first gen Ryzen CPUs that just shipped with pretty low clock speeds, to give it a bit of an overclock, because that'll give you a lot more performance. And lastly, Fortnite, which was tested at 1080p using competitive settings with a 50% render scale, so like 480p or whatever that is. At 3 GHz, we got an average FPS of 242 with a 1% low of 97, and then at 3.925 GHz, we got an average of 263 with the 1% low of 137. So this is a lot smaller of an increase than we saw in Valorant, but with that 1% low, that's going to be a pretty big difference, especially if you're playing with like a high refresh rate monitor. You're getting that 1% low above 120 frames per second and pretty close to that 144 that you usually want to be hitting with high refresh rate. I did actually notice that there were like less noticeable micro stutters. There were a few noticeable when you were running at 3 GHz, so here the overclock really helped, even if it doesn't look like it quite as much in the numbers. Alright, so the performance gain you get from overclocking the Ryzen 7 1700 is pretty impressive, especially in those games like Valorant, where it can actually getting like a 20% increase in clock speed gives you a 20% increase in performance. So for like, I don't know, 9 months now, this 3.7 GHz overclock has been running great, and it's been running great with that 4 GHz for videos where I test out like graphics cards and stuff like that. So the overclocks shown in this video are stable, and for the most part, for just gaming, the voltage I was using for that 3.925 GHz runs fine at 4 GHz. So you can run at a lower voltage and you need to pass Cinebench. It's just the voltage that you need to be stable for what you do. So if you're just using your CPU for gaming, you might not need it to necessarily pass Cinebench. Like for a while I was running the CPU at that full 4 GHz and it wouldn't pass Cinebench, but I only had it crash on me once. Some programs like DaVinci Resolve love crashing, but I mean, if it passes Cinebench, it'll run almost everything. A lot of people are big on stuff like IDA 64 and Prime 95, but for what I do, and I guess what most people will probably be using their CPU for, if it passes a single pass in Cinebench, you should be stable for most everything. The 3.7 and 3.925 GHz I did show here both do fail Prime 95. They pass IDA 64, so that is a bit less, I guess, intensive or whatever than Prime 95, but these overclocks are definitely stable. Both of them, I haven't ran that 3.925 GHz one a lot, but I ran it for probably about a week just to test it out for this video, and both those overclocks are stability that I was fine with. I haven't had either of these ever crash, so you should be good with just kind of testing out with a single or maybe like a 10-minute run in Cinebench for stability. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.